All right. I think we should get started. Shall be waiting for the rest of the folks to join us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Today we are going to be focusing on Azure Networking. And understanding the fundamentals of networking is one of the crucial steps in getting started with working on Azure. Well, like I said, today we are going to be looking at the introductory bit of Azure networking, setting up the virtual networks in Azure, getting started with subnets. I'll be taking you through the very first core concepts. It's going to be the theory bit of it, and then you are going to be wrapping up with a demonstration on how we can create a virtual network in the Azure portal. Well, moving along, don't forget for the inclusive guidelines to conducting our online meetings. You need to respect others in the chat. If you're to utilize the chat, you also need to tag your question with a Q. That is if you have a question in the chat. And also, you need to mute yourself if you're not speaking. Yeah, as usual, it's one of our inclusive guidelines. Well, moving along, the agenda for today. We are going to be looking at the introduction to Azure networking. And we are going to be looking at how we can set up the virtual networks in the Azure portal. You're also going to be looking at a brief introduction on Azure Load Balancers and then traffic management in Azure. And then we are also going to be wrapping up with how we can create a virtual network practically in Azure portal. But before we move along, I'm just curious to know if there's anyone that faced a challenge when it comes to creating a virtual network. Sorry, when it comes to setting up your account in Azure. Did anyone face that issue? Maybe probably I can hope after the call. All right. I think there is no any query towards that. So moving forward, when it comes to a virtual network, basically it's like you conceptualizing a physical network infrastructure. So suppose the organization that you're working in wants to shift from the premises configurations of a network infrastructure, and probably it wants to migrate migrate to a cloud environment, right? So conceptually, it would ideally set up a network that is much similar to the physical network that has been set up. So conceptually, that is how a virtual network is. That is how a virtual network is set up. You would define a virtual network as simply an isolated environment for your resources to communicate securely, right? So you wouldn't like other probably other organization to tap into your Azure resources. You wouldn't like any abrupt uh, access to your Azure resources. So you would, in other words, come up with an Azure virtual network to simply have that sort of communication between different resources within Azure. And when you're to think of virtual networks, you can go ahead and set up those individual small virtual networks. You may call them as subnets. So conceptually, subnets, like I told you, they are like they are split from the actual network that you would think of. Initially, you might come up with a working virtual environment, a virtual network, but you would, in other words, have those individual small virtual networks. So those could be called as subnets, right? So I would maybe give a scenario of working within an organization. So you might have a team that could actually work on the back end. You could have a team that maybe works on the front end, business logic, all that. So you would all go ahead and set up individual subnets for each and every category within the organization. So that is conceptually what a virtual network would look like. Moving along, we need to visualize this in higher detail. So the screen that you're seeing here is conceptually like the way you would set up a virtual network in Azure. First things first, you would access the Azure portal. I'll be demonstrating that as we move along. First things first, you would establish your virtual network by going to the Azure portal, and then obviously you tap into the resources section and search for the virtual network. But this diagram here basically gives a high-level overview of how the virtual network would look like. And as you can see here, in the virtual network, you might have several virtual machines. Here, I'm actually having one virtual machine, which is actually nesting other virtual machines. But in a virtual network, you might have several resources, several Azure resources, like virtual machines, storage accounts. Think of any Azure resource that you might want to use within your organization. Conceptually, as you might see, as a developer, you might SSH into your environment, your Azure machine, Azure virtual machine, and that environment will basically be exposed with a public IP address, right? So that's what you can use to tap into some of the resources for your network configurations. And essentially, you can see here the network security group, which is abbreviated as NSG. And what that basically means is it controls the network traffic to your network resources within Azure. In other words, it is going to be limiting. Oh, I can see a hand up.
Yes, so I was asking about the SSH. Can I use a VPN to tap into the resources remotely?
Yes, they definitely can use that. Well, I think that is going to be out of the scope for this study session, but I can organize one-on-one call so that we go through this on how you can SSH into your network infrastructure in Azure. Yeah, is that fine?
Yes, sir, it's fine.
All right, we shall organize a one-on-one call session. All right, so moving along, as you would realize, this is an overview of how you would have your network infrastructure, set up. At the top here, you would realize that you have. Just give me a minute. All right, so moving along, I can see a hand up. Go ahead and ask.
So
Edwin?
the diagram.
Sorry. I wasn't in position to get you well. Oh, I think I lost him. All right, so moving along, like I told you, this is a basic overview of how a network infrastructure would look like. So you first of all define your network infrastructure within a resource group. And within that resource group, you would basically go ahead and define loads and loads of virtual networks. So conceptually, within an organization, you might have several virtual networks. And within those virtual networks, you might have several subnets. In other words, those individual small virtual networks that you might look at. And within those subnets, rather the small networks, you might have several resources deployed within that. So resources that you may think of may be virtual networks, storage accounts, and all that. Yeah, I hope that one basically gives us an overview of how we could set up our virtual infrastructure, virtual network infrastructure. And moving along, when we are to look at the benefits of the resource segmentation within virtual networks, and basically the very first component of the benefits would be the security, right? So by resource segmentation within virtual networks, we get that sort of enhanced security by isolating different types of resources, and that basically prevents unauthorized access and authorized access that maybe would have potential breaches to our applications. We might also have traffic isolation. By traffic isolation, I mean subnets can allow basically subnets can allow traffic isolation, and within the due course, that ensures efficient flow of data without interference from probably unrelated Azure resources. We could also have performance. You realize that when you're to segment your virtual network into several subnets, there tends to be some sort of reduced congestion and probably minimizing the distance that the data needs to travel from one resource to another. So this actually improve the performance within your organization if you're to adopt to the virtual networks and then the subnets as well. And so you could as well have customization where you could actually have that sort of customizing your individual subnets to hold individual amount of resources that you need. And we are going to be also visualizing that as we move along. You also get a chance to utilize the scale and management feature when you to segment your virtual network. And by that, simply means that the management of resources and other virtual configuration is made easier. So you, in other words, have that sort of monitoring of your Azure resources within your organization. So moving along to the next slide. Moving along to the next slide, we have the Azure Load Balancers. And what the Azure Load Balancers do is to basically distribute the incoming network traffic to your Azure resources. So in other words, it would go ahead and redistribute the incoming traffic to your Azure resources from maybe the unhealthy instances to healthy instances. And they basically enhance the availability of your resources by ensuring that at any one point, if one of the resources fails, then others can continue to handle the incoming resources, right? So this diagram here basically gives you that sort of architecture for Azure load balancers, and you would realize that when you play around with the Azure load balancers, you get the chance of higher availability within your organization. In other words, they provide fault tolerance by directing the traffic from some of the unhealthy resources to those that are healthy within the long run. Moving along, like I said, when you're to work with the virtual networks, you get to play around with the traffic management policies. By traffic manager, we get access to bits of management policies. One of them being latency, in that at any one point of time, if one of the virtual networks fails, we can route a particular resource need to the closest service as soon as possible. And we get to work with the round robin sort of architecture, where the incoming requests are basically distributed in a round robin manner to each and every available resource. And the round robin sort of traffic management policy gives us a simple and effective, but it doesn't actually consider the resource healthy and the capacity sort of stuff. We also get to work on the failover instances, in that at any one point of time, if one of the subnets fails, we get to have our data backed up in the cloud. Yeah, you can also nest several resources within the Azure portal. So suppose you have a particular virtual network, and within that virtual network you have several subnets. So you can go ahead and have that sort of nested resources within that subnet. So moving along to the next slide. Basically, this I wanted us to have a brief introduction on the Azure networking, but there's a lot to cover under that. But simply, when you want to get certified as a network engineer by Azure, you would simply sit for an AZ700 certification. I remember I talked about the AZ900 certification that basically tests and validates your skills when it comes to Azure cloud concepts and Azure services. So when it comes to the Azure network engineer, you would sit for the AZ700 certification that basically takes you through designing and implementing Microsoft Azure networking solutions. And I would urge you to basically look at everything that is in the Azure fundamentals, that is the AZ900 certification, because whatever that is in the AZ700 certification, sorry, whatever that is in the AZ900 certification is covered in the AZ700 certification. So you need to get familiar with everything that is in the AZ900 certification, because you're going to be encountering everything when it comes to the AZ700 certification. So moving along to the next slide, we basically need to, I don't know how I organized these slides the same round, because this was supposed to be before the previous one. But when it comes to creating your virtual network, after this slide, I think we can dive into the practical bit of that. But essentially, when it comes to creating your virtual network, you could have several subnets, like I described earlier on. In that virtual network, you could have several subnets. You could have the front subnet, the front end subnet, the back end subnet, and then probably the business logic subnet. Those could be taken as different tiers. So the front end subnet would be taken as a front end tier. So in other words, in that subnet, in that front end subnet, you would go ahead and define those front end resources that you might come up with in developing your front end implementation. And for the back end subnet, that is going to be housing those individual resources that you might come up with implementing your back-end infrastructure. So in that subnet, you might have things like databases, storage accounts, all that. So that subnet, like I've told you, houses everything that has to do with front-end implementation. This is a basic overview on how you can create your virtual network, but you can as well go ahead and define multiple subnets within that virtual network. Maybe the other subnet that you would think of would be the business logic, where you get to set up resources for your business infrastructure, like access to subscriptions for your organization, literally anything to do with the business infrastructure. So moving along to the next slide. This slide is basically going to, how to be housing all those modules and probably the helping files that would help you to get started with that. The very first one would be the repository. Again, I need to stretch out this. Please, if you find any error within the modules on GitHub, get back to me so that I put those ones right. And then also you need to access a particular folder. I remember having told you that each and every study session that we are going to be holding, we are going to be housing those study materials on GitHub. However, if you're not familiar with GitHub, just ping me up so that I take you through some of the study sessions for GitHub. So moving along to the next slide. For now, we need to go through on how we can create our virtual network. So just allow me stop sharing this screen so that I access my Azure portal. All right, so here you get to realize that when it comes to the Azure portal, you only look out for that particular resource that you need to have access to. So when it comes to creating an Azure virtual network, first things first would you would go to the Azure portal like you're seeing here. So in the interface that you're seeing, you may go ahead and type in the particular resource that you need to have access to. That is, if you can't see it on the dashboard, you would go ahead and type in manually to have access to that particular resource. So since mine is visible here on the dashboard, I'm just going to go ahead and create that. Just click on create. Just click on create. So like any other resource that you need to have access to, you house everything in a resource group. Like I told you, a resource group is like a container where you host all your resource groups. So those could be like virtual machines, storage accounts, DevOps infrastructures, all that. So essentially here, I'm just going to create another resource group. I'm just going to call this as a resource group, and then the VNet, simple as that. So I'm just going to click OK. That is my new resource group. And moving along, you need to give it a name. You need to give your virtual network a name. So I'll go ahead and maybe say I need to create a virtual network for my security department. Within the organization, I need to create a virtual network for my security department, or maybe a virtual network for the developers, for development. Should be pretty descriptive. So you choose a location that is next to you, and when you scroll through the networks, the regions, you realize that the nearest one to us is South Africa North. and you get this sort of recommendation. In other words, you would maybe choose one of these locations for you to house your virtual network infrastructure. So I'm just going ahead to click on South Africa North, and that being done, I'll go ahead and access the next tab by either clicking on next or this one here. I'll just click on next. So by default, Azure gives you a protected environment for your resources, but you can go ahead and set up firewalls. As you can see here, it's basically a managed cloud-based network security service that basically protects your Azure virtual network resources. But you could as well have this configured for the rest of the resources. But for now, I'll basically maybe click on enable the Azure firewall, and you realize that it gives you a similar name to the resource group that to the virtual network that you created. So in other words, it is going to be VNet dev, and then the firewall. For that tier, I would recommend that you choose the standard one by default. Just leave that to default. For the premium one, then that will basically be consider that you're going to be paying for extra features, extra security features for your virtual network. But for now, we are going to go with the standard tier. And for the policy, you would basically go with the default one, which is the standard one. But you could go ahead and configure others. So here I'm just going to be defining a firewall policy. So just go ahead and click on that. By default, that's what it brings. But you could go ahead and associate yourself with the rest of the Azure firewall public IP addresses. So moving along, when it comes to the Azure protected environment, which is under the security, if you want an extra protected layer for the Azure network, you would go ahead and check this checkbox that basically exposes you to an extra subscription environment. In other words, you're going to be paying for the Azure protected environment against denial of service attacks. So for now, I'm just going to leave that to default. But if you need to study more about the DDoS attacks, can go ahead and click that and get started with that. But I'm just going to leave that empty. Azure, as I move back to the top, you realize that you have this Azure Bastion paid service that basically helps you to SSH, have that sort of SSH connection to your virtual networks. I remember one of the colleagues on the call asked about how to maybe SSH into those virtual machines. So this is basically going to be for maybe future study sessions. But for now, I'm just going to be checking those this checkbox that maybe enable Azure Bastion. And by default, it gives you a name basing on the name of the virtual network that you set up. And it actually gives you the Azure Bastion public API address that you could use. Just going ahead to after going through the security measures, I'm going to go to the next tab, which is the IP addresses. So by default, when you're to create your virtual environment, Azure is going to be assigning this IP address to your virtual network, and that is it basically consists of the subnet mask, which is 16, but you would go ahead and explore other addresses that are currently available. But for now, I'm just going to go with the default one with a subnet mask of that. And then moving along, you would realize that it actually creates some default subnets for you. If you don't want those default subnets, you would go ahead and delete. Like, I don't want a default one, but be sure to leave the rest of the subnets which actually are pre-configured with those firewall configurations. And moving along, you would maybe go ahead and create another subnet. Remember, in the previous slides, I talked about the several subnets that you would create within the organization. So conceptually here, you might come up with a subnet. This is the IP address space, and before we move along, I'm going through this assuming that you guys know how to play around with IP addresses, the IP version 4, IP version 6. So I'm assuming that you're already familiar with that kind of stuff. That's why we are going through this a little bit fast. But moving along, you realize that for the subnet details, basically that subnet that's going to be housing particular resources that you need. So it gives you a default template. By default, that is by default, but then by name, you would go ahead and give it a name. Suppose you have a virtual network that you want it to consist back-end infrastructure. So you would go ahead and say, I want a back-end frontier, right? In other words, a back-end subnet that is going to be housing the databases and all that. So I would go ahead and say, I want this to be a back-end subnet within my virtual network. And the starting address by default, I think you might leave this to that by default, but you can go ahead and configure a few changes. The security part of that, you would go ahead and maybe create a network security group. Like I told you, a network security group. It basically controls access to your Azure resources. In other words, it controls that sort of the network traffic to your resources, right? So in that network security group, you would go ahead and define several rules on how the external environment might have access to your network resources. So for now, as a demonstration, I'll just go ahead and maybe create a new one. I'm just going to call this as a backend network security group. I'll go ahead and create. As you can see, it's a network security group that basically defines all those rules for external access to your Azure resources. So having reviewed those, just going ahead to click on add, clicking on add the subnet. As you realize, it has been created, it has been added to the network IP addresses section of that. So you could go ahead and maybe create other subnets. As for demonstration, let me go ahead and create one for front end quickly. Just go maybe define another security group. Let me just leave that to default. Go ahead and create. As you realize, it has also been created. So having done that, let's move along to the next section, the tags. And basically the tags are key value pairs that basically define how the rest of the Azure resources would be communicating to this virtual network. So in here, I would maybe by default, I would go ahead and use default templates, but you would as well define your own implementation. Maybe I would say I would define a key value pair tag that would be used to communicate to the rest of the Azure resources. By default, let me just leave that to that, and then move to review and create. So you may either click that or click on the bottom section, review, and then create. As you would realize, these are the details that we've been playing around with. We set up our resource group into our Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. Yours might look a little bit different based on what you signed up for earlier on. Moving along, you would see that our name for the network, for the virtual network is VNet Dev, that basically houses the subnets for front end, back end, and maybe the business logic. The region for the virtual network, as we said, it must be close enough to your physical location. So in Africa, our closest one is South Africa North. So that's it for the security section. Those are the details, and then the IP addresses and all that. The tags, as you can see, those are basically used to, as a communication measure to the rest of the Azure resources. So moving along, having reviewed all that, like reviewing is basically being contented with what you've already set up, right? So having reviewed the details, we could go ahead and create. You realize that the deployment runs in the background. It takes a little bit longer to deploy all that. Maybe as we wait for it to get deployed, I could maybe be answering some of the questions in the background. Any questions so far? Yeah, I can see a hand up. Yes, Edwin, you can unmute yourself and ask. Edwin? All right. So probably we can move along.
I no longer have a question.
Oh, unfortunately, but I maybe answer that in the long run after the call. So I realize that the deployment process takes a bit longer because these are really huge deployments that you're playing around with, where they actually consist of the firewalls for security configurations. They always, bits of junk that actually runs within the background that you would actually not get to know all that. But essentially, it helps us to overcome that burden of the physical setup. So as we wait for a couple of minutes, probably I could go ahead and share another virtual network that I created earlier on, because this is basically going to take a bit longer, like approximately 3 to 5 minutes for it to get done. But for now, I'm just going to be accessing another virtual network that I had created earlier on, just to take you through all that. So on my Azure portal, you realize that I have this virtual network that I had created earlier on. And this virtual network basically consists of several subnets. I earlier on created the default subnet. I think it's done. Let me move back. Oh, not yet. It's taking a little bit longer, but moving along. Let me just click on one of the subnets. So by default, when you're to set up a particular virtual network with all those firewalls and then Azure Bastion, it would basically give you this sort of interface whereby you would basically have a maximum of 551 available IP addresses. So conceptually, it gives you 200 and did I say 500? It's actually 251, right? So by default, it gives you 251, but when you to access that particular subnet, the total number of IP addresses are basically 256. Why do you see 251 IP addresses available? Simply because Azure retains 5 IP addresses for its internal implementation, right? So you're not going to be using these IP addresses when it comes to deploying the rest of the Azure resources. So when it comes to a particular subnet, as you can see in this Azure portal, we only have 251 IP addresses, and even other subnet that I had created earlier on, you have access to 251 IP addresses. The rest of the 5 are basically for Azure internal implementations, so you're not going to be having access to those. So in other words, I would say that when it comes to this address, the very first chunks of that, maybe the 1.1, sorry, 1.2, 0.3, 0.4, you're not going to be having access to those. You can only start off from 0.5 and onwards, right? So the rest of those are not going to be available for access. Maybe I would move back. Oops, the deployment is taking long. Maybe I would just close this and try to access it from the Azure portal. Yeah, you realize that the deployment actually is still running in the process, as you realize. But let's first conceptualize this. Some of the subnets that we already have here. So you realize that we created one of the subnets that we created was for the back end tier, and then the front end tier, and the security groups that you're seeing here. You only have the back end network security groups. I'll be sharing some of the resources to all this so that you get familiar on how to fully create the virtual network and all those subnets. So conceptually, when I to click on that, since the deployment has not completed, that's why you're seeing most of these things are not complete, because ideally it's still running in the background. So maybe to move back to the virtual network that I had created earlier on, I've already gone through some of these, where you get to play around with all those details. But on the left-hand side, you realize that you have a bunch of details that you might look at. The activity log basically is gives you an overview of the timeline on how your Azure resources have been accessed. Maybe that could be within your organization. You have a bunch of developers, bunch of security administrators, all that. So this activity log basically gives you sort of a timeline on how your network infrastructure has been accessed by the rest of the teammates. The access control, which is the identity identity management tool. In other words, it's identity as a service tool that basically helps you to define which guys are meant to have access to this virtual network. Of course, within your organization, not everyone is going to be having access to the virtual network. That would break the entire infrastructure. Suppose you have maybe an HR within your organization. You may go ahead and maybe say, I'm going to be defining a rule that maybe would deny an HR to have access to the virtual network, because ideally an HR may not have that knowledge to play around with the virtual networks, to set up the virtual network. So you may go ahead and define rules that may be within my organization. I could maybe probably have several roles. I might have the owner, the overall owner, that may be the administrator. I might have the contributor. Those could be maybe the developers that contribute to the development of a particular software. We might as well have the readers. Readers may only get to read what has been implemented, but they may not have that access to changing details within the Azure portal, within the organization rather. So you'd go ahead and define those roles that I would maybe probably deny a reader isn't going to have access to, to my virtual network. But of course, since here I'm having a bunch of colleagues that I'm working with, so I'm not going to be playing around with these details because they're a little bit sensitive. But basically, this gives you an overview on how you could have that sort of identity as service management configurations within your organization. You could go ahead and define role assignments. I think this one is actually one of the things that we are going to be looking at when it comes to the rest of the study sessions. Checking access. We are also going to be looking at that as we move along in the rest of the study sessions. And I think it's going to be one of the, let me scroll and see. Yeah, it's going to be Azure Identity and Security. So just prepare for that. We're going to be looking at most of these things, how we can utilize them. So moving along to the virtual network that you had created. Yeah, perfect. The deployment is successful as you realize. So just going to go to the resource, of course, and realize that here we have a couple of capabilities that you might explore. The DDoS protection measures that you could go ahead and explore if you were to click on that. By default, it is disabled because it's a premium feature, but you would go ahead and try to enable that, and you could agree with all that. So if you go ahead and create this DDoS protection plan, it is going to expose an extra subscription plan to your current Azure subscription. But for now, I'm just going to discard that and move back to the dashboard. The Azure Firewall, like I said, it's that sort of protective measurement for your infrastructure. The Azure pairing part of that, like I said, in an organization, you might have several virtual networks. But when you want those virtual networks to communicate to each other, you might use something called the pairing, right? So in here, you might go ahead and maybe say that in this virtual network that I have, which is called VNet Dev, I wanted to have access to another virtual network. In other words, I wanted to communicate to another virtual network, right? So in here, I would go ahead and define that pairing link name. By default, you're going to be allowing, to have that sort of communication to the rest of the virtual networks. But for now, since I have other virtual networks that are a little bit sensitive, I'm just going to leave that, and I'll be demonstrating that to from my Azure, my other virtual Azure network subscription. So I'm just going to go back to the VNet Dev virtual network. Yeah, on the overview section, you could as well play around with a few things. You could if you don't know how to set up the virtual network, if you've actually forgotten how to do that, you could go ahead and explore these tutorials. They are free of charge. And the topology bit of it, this is not visible enough because our virtual networks, in other words, our subnets within these virtual networks are actually empty. In other words, they don't have resources within them. But if they had resources within them, you could go ahead and click on the topology bit of it, and then basically go ahead and conceptualize how resources are communicating to each other within the virtual network. So basically, that has given us an overview of how we can create a virtual network. I would lastly implore you to have access to the Azure virtual learning sandbox that we are going to be utilizing in most of the study sessions. And basically, this gives us an overview on how we could set up a virtual network. Of course, this study session has not been in much detail, but you would go ahead and explore all this stuff. I'll be providing the links to other resources that you may explore. And the other thing would be to access this tutorials section within Azure Virtual Network. You would click on the tutorial section and then have access to the rest of the stuff. So I hope this has been descriptive. I will be updating the rest of the folders as we move along. For now, I'll allow me to maybe welcome a few questions. But before that, like I said, when you want to become a certified Azure Network Engineer, you would explore this study path session. And essentially, I'm going to be I'm going to be providing some cloud skills challenges at the end, of which I'm going to be distributing certificates at the end. That is if you participate fully in some of those cloud skills challenges. So just be alert. At the end of that, I'll be announcing some of those cloud skills challenges, of which you're going to be getting certificates. But for now, you would go ahead and explore this study path, which is approximately 10 hours of study. So you would go ahead and explore that. Let me actually go ahead and share this in the chat. Yeah, so I've shared a link to the network engineering path that you may explore. You may check in the chat and get access to the modules within that. So allow me welcome some questions before we end the call. Yes, Jonah, you can unmute and ask.
Yes, yesterday I started to use the student credit for Microsoft Azure because
Yes,
our campus, we don't have email addresses for campus, so I was left out.
you left out. Oh, sorry about. Is there anyone else that faced some challenge, some issue? Anyone else? Jonah, is that Makerere?
No, sir, I'm from Maltech Business School.
Oh, okay. Well, if the email is not recognized within the setup of the account, I would recommend you sign up for the $200 credit by putting in your credit card credentials. Of course, you're not going to be charged because they actually want to track if actually you're a human being, so you're not going to be charged.